All right, I think we can start. So welcome everybody to this already fourth IAUC seminar on local climate zones. So I'm very happy to have you all attending. Today the topic is local climate zones. So there's currently lots more research going on using this classification system. So we thought it would be good to take a step back and look at the origins of the LCZ classification system and how it came to be, and which Ian is going to talk about, Ian Stewart, and then Matthias will talk about current research and future directions that we want to head into. So Ian will start. So he's Ian Stewart is a research fellow at the Global Cities Institute at the University of Toronto. So he did this during his PhD with supervised by Tim Oak. He developed this local climate zones classification system and won several awards. And I just checked the citation index, the number of citations, and it already has 1,931 citations. So really being used very well. So Ian, take it away. The floor is yours, or screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for the introduction, and thank you to all of the members of the webinar committee for the invitation to join this event today. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be involved, and I'm delighted to hear what the other speakers have to say, and I'm sure it'll be a very interesting discussion. So I'll just get started here, and I thought that I would start by giving a more personal account of the local climate zones in this particular webinar, rather than giving an overview of some of the general characteristics of the scheme, because those are already well documented, and I thought I might try to provide something a little more personal. And what you're looking at here on this cover slide is a photograph of a group of professors and students, mainly engineers, but also architects and from other disciplines. And they've gathered at the National University in Columbia, and they're discussing the local climate zones system. They've used it, they're familiar with it, and they're giving some very valuable feedback. And so I think this kind of discussion is very important to what lies ahead for the LCZ system. And I'll come back to this group at the end of the talk. To begin, however, I'd like to start with the question, why was the LCZ system created? And I often get asked this question, and I often start with the same story, and that is I go back to September of 2004. And this was my very first meeting with Professor Tim Oak in his office at the University of British Columbia. And one of the first things he did when we met was to put down the urban climate zones in front of me.
Great.
And ask for my opinion. And so we had a great conversation about that, and we shared a common vision for how we might elaborate that scheme, and mainly to address some of its properties, such as the nomenclature that's involved or the surface parameters, and how we might extend it to include some urban climate zones. And that's ultimately where the local climate zones comes from. And this was a scheme that was recently printed by Tim in a WMO document for citing meteorological instruments in urban areas, and in particular to cite them in places where they can gather representative measurements. So my first task on that very interesting and fascinating project was to go into the field. And so I visited many sites in different parts of the world where urban heat island researchers had been gathering their temperature data mostly from standard meteorological stations, and to begin documenting what I saw, documenting the land cover, documenting the exposure, what were the surroundings around the sites, and to conceive how all of this might be placed into a general classification that has application in any city in the world. And so you can see just by this collection of a few photographs that the diversity is quite great. These are only urban sites. If you add in all the rural sites and you add in all the other sites that come from crowdsourcing and volunteer and unofficial stations, the diversity is really quite enormous. So jumping ahead over about 7 years of methodology takes us to 2012. And that's when the scheme was published in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. And really what it is it's attempted to be an explicit and very consistent representation of built and natural landscapes at the local scale. And so we arrived at 17 classes in total. And we felt this was a sufficient balance between the complexity that's represented in those sites, but in the simplicity of its use. And any classification, its success will depend very much upon that balance between simplicity and complexity. Now, the LCZ system, much like the UCZ system before it, addresses a very considerable problem in the heat island literature. And that is, in many cases, we don't know anything about the sites that are used to collect the temperature data. And that's because metadata are so rarely provided in those documents. And by that, I mean measures of the exposure or the cover around the sites, the instrument specifications, and so on. And so this has become a research area of mine that I've continued in the last 10 years. And you can see that I've reviewed over 265 peer-reviewed papers. And the vast majority of those are not meeting the metadata requirements that we like to see. And without those metadata, it's very difficult to know if the temperatures are representative of an appropriate scale for a heat island study. So the LCZs were put together to address that problem, among others. And the suggested uses that we put forward in the original publication in 2012 are listed here. And primarily the scheme is intended to classify landscapes or measurement sites according to the surface properties that are relevant to the local climate. And that here largely means the temperature climate at standard screen height of a couple of meters above the ground. Now, once that's accomplished, many other secondary or derivative uses of the scheme can surface. I've listed a few of them here, but related to heat island studies, the LCZs help us to configure our networks of instruments across the city or to design a survey route. And once we have those data, we can define and compare and report our heat island magnitudes in a somewhat consistent fashion for any cities anywhere. We can also build spatial databases in the form of maps, and the LCZs can provide a fairly basic or generic data set for input into different kinds of models. Now, ultimately, I think the real essence or the spirit of the scheme is to help clarify scientific exchange, particularly among urban heat island researchers, because as I showed on a couple slides ago, metadata continues to be an issue in this particular literature. But the process starts by a shift in thinking from the city scale, which is the traditional urban-rural comparison of meteorological measurements, down to the local or the neighborhood scale, and then considering those climatic differences within the city, intra-urban, and even within the rural environment itself, which also can be quite diverse, intra-rural. And the idea is to gather any resources that are available to you, any metadata that are available to you, and attempt a first order classification or description of the sites in the areas. And it's not meant to be a burden or an onerous task to gather those resources. They should be ones that are available to you in the form of maps or photographs or field observations or whatever you have. And ultimately that allows you to begin to set a spatial framework to lay down some sites for measurements, and if you wish to connect those sites through a temperature traverse or automobile traverse across the city, again, keeping the LCZ framework in mind. And accomplishing that, we now have the beginnings of a fairly simple protocol to define the heat island magnitude in a more explicit and more coherent fashion than what's normally given in the literature. And so here is just a simple conceptual diagram to show that we can combine pairs of LCZ classes, not only within the city, but within the urban, rural area as well. And this ultimately improves communication because inherent in each of those classes that we choose are the metadata that have been missing for so many years in the literature. So here's a very good example. There are many examples in the literature. This is one of my favorites, and this is from Warsaw, Poland. And it's a favorite of mine because it illustrates many of the things we're meant to be thinking about when we do LCZ work. And that is, it shows very clearly the temperature fluctuations from week to week, which depend largely on the weather conditions. It shows the relation between the built form of the neighborhood and the temperature signal. And perhaps most important, it shows that the regional temperatures that come from the airport are not representative of the local temperatures that come from the individual LCZ classes. So this is a nice example. It's been repeated in many cities around the world, and it demonstrates to us that the system is a fairly robust piece of work. Now, I'd just like to say very quickly something about maps. Our next speaker, Matthias, is going to give us a very interesting overview of LCZ mapping. I just think it's important to make a distinction between different kinds of maps because they each have their own texture and their own uses. And the maps that I'm illustrating here are local scale field maps that can be created just by a visit to a field site and documenting some of the geographical characteristics that are sometimes missed in a city scale or a metropolitan scale map. And I think these are ideal for classifying individual sites and again for designing networks and mobile survey routes and so on. Now here's a few more examples. These are a little bit larger study areas, but these are each quite small cities, so it's manageable to take a field approach or to involve field observations in sketching out quite a simple map like these. Now the automated digital maps are ideal, obviously, for much larger areas, and they're much more efficient, and they can generate data sets that are very, very valuable to doing analysis and climate modeling and so on. And we've seen some very good work coming out of WUDAP and Benjamin Bechtel, and Matthias will give us a good look at that in a few minutes. Now, when we're working with LCZs, there's a few common pitfalls that we need to be aware of, and by this I mean unexpected or challenges or difficulties that we might not foresee coming. And it's important to recognize these because they help us to improve our own work. And some of them are related to the inherent limitations of the LCZ classification and to any classification in general. And sometimes they originate out of misconceptions of the LCZ classification. So the first one is confusion of spatial scales. I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. The second one is the exclusion of natural effects. And there's a tendency to overlook the effects of weather or surface relief and elevation and so on. And that is because in the LCZ scheme, these features are taken somewhat as assumptions that they're rather simple and that the study is being carried out in rather simplified terrain. If it isn't, then the user has to make some accommodation for that and to communicate these natural effects. The third one is a disconnection from the field. This is probably a common factor in all of environmental sciences, and so much of what we do now is driven by technology. I think it's important to have a good balance between work we do in the field with our own visual observations and to marry that with all of the benefits that come with the digital or the virtual environment. And so to keep that in a good balance. And the fourth one, assumptions of regional bias. I often read that the LCZ is particularly biased to modern cities or well-planned cities. This is something that we tried very hard to avoid. And in fact, we created the LCZ specifically to involve cities of all descriptions and all types. But the assumption is an easy one to make because the LCZ graphics illustrate very uniform and very tidy looking pieces of urban and rural areas. And that's largely because we start from a simple representation and from which the zones can be mixed and matched using subclasses and so on. And so it's really just a starting point. Now back to the first one, the confusion of spatial scales, micro versus local. This is a very good example that I often use. This is the Astronomical Observatory in the center of Quito, Ecuador. It's one of the oldest climate observatories in Latin America. And you can see immediately the problem that we have here. At the micro scale, within a few meters of the instruments, the climate instruments, the surroundings are very different from those in the local area around that instrument to a few hundred meters. And so this is a tricky problem if we're trying to classify this site. And it's tricky because the micro and local scales are blended, and there's often not a clear boundary between the two, even though when we look at the illustration, you can see a clear boundary. And so we have to think about the weather conditions, the wind flow or the airflow, the formation of internal boundary layers in each of these areas, and so on. Now, the LCZ doesn't resolve this problem, but it does give us the nomenclature. It gives us the tools to communicate this problem and to be aware of it, and ultimately to take a critical eye towards the placement of stations in cities or the use of data from existing stations. Now, just to spend a few minutes on what I think lies ahead, it's important to address some of these pitfalls in LCZ work. And in my view, there are two critical areas that are in need of further elaboration. One is the development of a set of field methods or guidelines that can help us to make non-instrumented observations of basic urban canopy parameters. So this involves walking through the streets, moving through the streets, and having the ability and the skill set to make judgments about building height, height-width ratios, and so on. The second one is to elaborate the site description of the LCZ classes. That's simply to integrate a set of surface relief classes for cities and neighborhoods that are in very complex topography, and you can see an example of that in the photograph to the right. So the last few years has seen the development rather slowly of something called the LCZ Field Guide. And the essence of this guide is that learning of the LCZs begins in the field, if possible, and then moves into the digital environment and to reap those benefits. So part one of the LCZ Field Guide is really a stepwise process that involves identifying LCZs in their natural environment, again, if possible, through street level traverses, either on foot, or if that's not possible, using a geo browser, and following a set of instructions that takes the user through cognitive exercises to estimate some of these very basic parameters. Now, these is not exact measurements, but it allows us at least to get the site or the neighborhood into its proper class. And we can use this for many things, such as the source area of an instrument or just a predefined neighborhood. But there might also be a role for this in helping in this helping in the selection of WUDAP training areas. And the part two of the guide is the selection of surface relief classes. Now, these are derived from an existing orographic classification of cities based on Bonner and Villager in 1989. Those are scaled down to the local scale, and users simply select one of the one of the relief classes to best match with what the topography is in their site. And again, this can apply to a measurement site, or it can apply to an urban neighborhood, or what have you. So just to conclude, I'd like to say that this field guide that's been in development for a few years is and has been tested in South America in a number of locations where students and professors from various disciplines are going through the steps of the guide, and they're classifying a sample of sites and providing very valuable experiences and feedback that I think are crucial to improving that guide so that it's simple to use and that it's accessible to everyone. And you can see that 3 versions have already been developed. Each version is improved on the previous one based on the feedback that's obtained. And so currently there's a version being tested at the University of Chile with 25 postgraduate students in architecture course on urbanism. And a 4th version will soon be tested, and the location has not been determined, but if anyone is interested, please get in touch, and I'd be happy to set something up. So I think I'll end with that, Natalie, and I'll turn it over to Matthias.
All right, thanks very much, Ian. So up next, so if you have any questions about the talk, just feel free to post your question in the chat. But we're going to move on with the next speaker and have a discussion afterwards. So the next speaker is Matthias de Mussere. So he's a senior scientist at the Ruhr University in Bochum, in Germany. So he did his PhD in Leuven, in Belgium. And he has worked on various different topics from regional climate modeling, urban modeling, and currently has a really nice paper out making LCZ maps, which I'm sure he's going to talk about now. So it's the LCZ generator. So he will talk about the current research on LCZ mapping and future directions. So take it away, Mattia.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie, for the introduction. Let me first share my screen. There you go. First of all, thanks to the IUC community for having me. And today I will talk about my experience with digital LCZ mapping and its many applications. Most of the content of the talk comes from the work I contributed to myself, yet I would also like to acknowledge the many studies out there dealing with LCZ mapping and its many applications, efforts that are crucial to push the science forward. But let me start with the last part of the title, the many ends. The most obvious applications of LCZ maps are, of course, temperature studies, in line with the original intent of the LCZ scheme. In an ongoing study, for example, for Moscow, we are currently assessing the thermal characteristics of local climate zones using an extensive official observation network, which is augmented with hundreds of citizen weather stations, which are retrieved from the NetAtmo network. In a subsequent analysis, this information is now also used to disentangle the role of local and mesoscale drivers of this UHI signal, concurrently addressing the often large intra-LCZ temperature variability. But also surface temperatures are often considered. For example, the study by Bechtel et al. That investigated the suitability of the LCZ scheme for surface urban heat island studies, which was based on 50 global cities using both MODIS and Landsat land surface temperature data. Moving away from temperature studies, Bruce et al. Demonstrated the potential of local climate zones for modeling malaria prevalence across 9 sub-Saharan cities. This work revealed that informal settlements and more open LCZs closer to wetlands have a higher malaria prevalence probability compared to more densely built areas. On another study on air quality, this one is also ongoing. This is currently exploring the added value of micro and local scale variables in empirical air pollution models. The work indicates that the combination of machine learning techniques together with such micro and local scale variables have the potential to improve national land use regression models targeting air quality. In 2019, my master's student Stefanie van Damme quantified Kunming's urbanization patterns using local climate zones for the period 2005 to 2017. She found that the first half of this period was dominated by urban expansion, while the second half was more prone to an internal restructuring with an increase in open LCZ classes. These findings were then cross-referenced with existing planning regulations, indicating the relation between policy strategies and LCZ changes. Yet the LCZ scheme is not only relevant for past urbanization, but can also be used for future urbanization projections. In this example for Brussels, we constructed future business as usual and sustainable LCZ scenarios based on the present-day LCZ map, on real planning policies and expected population growth. These future LCZ maps were then used in combination with greenhouse gas emission scenarios to force Vitol's Euroclim model and assess Brussels' future heat risk. This work provides a seamless transition to UDAP, the community initiative to facilitate a variety of urban-focused model application studies. The urban data generation within UDAP is structured in 3 levels of detail, where level 0 refers to the LCZ maps. So now I would like to take a small trip down memory lane and review how the LCZ mapping began and how it evolved until now. It was in 2015 that Benjamin Bechtel and co-authors introduced an automated procedure to map cities into LCZ, using freely available Landsat 8 information, labeled training areas for region of interest, and a random forest classifier which is embedded into the Saga GIS software. This framework was presented during the UDAT workshop at ICUC 9, and we were given an exercise, map the Houston region of interest into LCZ. I remember that when Johan Vedema passed by, I told them that instead of mapping single cities, I should probably directly aim for the whole of Belgium, as Belgium is only twice the size of the Houston region of interest. So back home, I started exploring this idea and rapidly bumped into a number of obstacles when visualizing some Landsat 8 scenes over Belgium. I wasn't really sure how to deal with the many overlapping tiles, whether this would work with the Saga classifier or how to perform an accuracy assessment. The solution was brought to me whilst attending a short course on Google Earth Engine at the EDU conference in 2016. I was introduced to the many capabilities of this platform and realized it could lead to a paradigm shift in LCZ mapping process. So that's how the journey started. Using Earth Engine, I first targeted the 4 Belgian cities for which I had good quality training areas. Then I derived seasonal composites of Landsat 8 imagery, not only for the spectral bands, but also for band ratios. And as such, I was able to create a Belgian-wide high-quality LCZ map. I also added an automated quality procedure by bootstrapping the classification 25 times, each time randomly splitting the labeled polygons into a stratified train and test sample. As this proof of concept over a limited area was found successful, I continued the implementation of more observation input features, including also Sentinel-1 and 2, and simultaneously testing their importance within the LCZ classification. This led me to a first version of the global LCZ map, which I presented at ICUC 10 in New York. At that point, a decision was made to take a step back and focus on large regions with abundant open urban data that are relevant as independent benchmarks for the LCZ maps. So we first released a European map, followed by a map for the continental United States. Note that both maps are available as open data from the link that is provided here. These maps have been benchmarked with a variety of independent data sets, such as ESA CCI's land cover, EU's imperviousness product, DONG's global anthropogenic heat flux data, and building height for 32 cities from EU's Urban Atlas project. We also use Skyview fraction data, which was retrieved by Ariane Middle and her team, and we benchmarked the US LCZ map against the building footprint dataset from Microsoft that contains well above 100 million building footprints covering all of the United States. So far, so good, yet all these developments fail to address one important shortcoming. How to disseminate the LCZ maps to the community? In this schematic from 2019, I highlighted 3 bottlenecks in the procedure. First, users are expected to voluntarily send their LCZ map to core members of WUDAP. Second, before the maps were put into the portal, they had to undergo a manual review. And third, there was no automated uplink in place to ingest the reviewed maps into the portal, all of which are difficult to maintain with a non-funded project such as WUDAP. And that's why we recently developed the LCZ generator, a web application that maps a city of interest into LCZ, solely expecting a valid training area file and some metadata as input. This tool basically incorporates all of the developments we worked on in the past 5 years. In the background, it uses more than 30 pre-processed global input features, which are derived from Landsat 8, Sentinel-1 and 2, and some other sensors, and it performs a classification within Google's Earth Engine. It returns an LCZ map and its probability, an automated accuracy assessment, some additional metadata, and shapefiles with suspicious training data. Results are sent via email, but can also be downloaded from an online dissemination table. The labeling of suspicious training data is added in order to allow users to improve their training dataset and resubmit it to the generator. It's performed in 3 steps, checking the surface area and shape of the polygons and whether or not a polygon's or pixel spectral signature is within the expected spectral range for that specific LCZ class. So let me try to switch screens and take you directly to the LCZ generator. So this is the landing page of the generator. You'll see a getting started section, and then you have 2 buttons which you can follow. So before you start your LCZ mapping procedure, please make sure that you read the guidelines. There is actually a section that you can expand here to get more details. So make sure everything is clear, and then you can continue to the form which you can use to submit your training data. Please provide some personal information. The email address is used because, or is needed because results are sent via email at this stage. And then here you can upload your training area file, and you have to provide some additional metadata. Once all is done, you can either consent or not to show your name in the submission table, and you have to agree with our terms of service and have read the attribution guidelines. Once all is filled in, submit your training data. And nowadays, you should get your results in 5 to 10 minutes via email, but your results will also show up in this submission table. So by default, we only show every best submission for per city and author. But if you want, you can see all other submissions as well by just clicking this button. So up to now, we have 123 entries submitted to the generator since its launch half of April, which is not too bad. Every column can be sorted. So let's have a look. Who's the lucky one? There's some submissions from Shanghai submitted today. And so every submission has a fact sheet. So you can have a look at the fact sheet. It basically condenses all the information that was provided to perform this classification. So there's the user information, submission information, details on the training areas with links to files that are behind it. There's the LCZ map and its accuracies, and there are a lot more links you can check here, for example, with a more detailed assessment of the accuracy using these bug plots. Then at the end, there's the terms of service and the attribution section guiding you on how to properly cite all the information in here. Let me go back. So then if you're back at the submission table, you can also select one or a few. I think we allow up to 10 simultaneously submissions to download. So just click the button and you can download them. Note that we also have a frequently asked questions section, answering a lot of questions already. Yet in case you do not find answers to your questions in this section, you can also create an issue on GitHub. So we provide this platform here where you can just add your issues, or if you want, you can also come up with or propose enhancements, and then we will look into them to see whether we can actually implement them into the official codes. Okay, let me go back to the slides now. There you go. And I would like to add a bit more to WoodApps, as the project is officially designed as an infrastructure to support modeling applications as well. So we are, of course, not only interested in facilitating the creation of LCZ maps. No, we are also working on a modeling ecosystem that provides the required open source tools to ingest relevant WoodApps information into urban models. In this example here, one can see the added value of LCZ-based parameters in the Cosmos CLM model over Moscow, compared to results using the default procedure available in Cosmos CLM and a simulation that was done using the best available reference data set for the city. The open source tools are available from the revised WoodApps web pages, in which we already added the LCZ generator and try to add tools catering for more models. So Cosmos CLM is already covered. We are currently working on an updated tool for WARF, and at the same time, you're developing similar tools for Suis or SuPy, it's the Python version of Suis, and UCLIM. To conclude, there is one important element of the LCZ scheme I did not mention yet, but that Ian already referred to, the role LCZ maps can play in science communication and discussion. In this picture from ICU C10, you can see the Shepherd Hall, the main room of the conference. The poster area was located just next to this room, and I remember that when walking around the posters, many of us already used LCZ maps in the research. Having these maps there allowed the spectator who is familiar with the LCZ scheme, but not with that city, to directly understand the makeup of the city, which greatly facilitates the discussion of the poster's content. And that's why, in the spirit of WoodApps, I would like to invite you all to submit the training data stored on your desktop to the generator, potentially improving your LCZ map and making your work accessible to others. And also to share your tools and data sets via open source repository. As a community, I believe personally we should make our data fair, as we all do better by working together. And most of all, let's hope we can all meet at ICU C11 in Sydney to discuss, amongst others, our LCZ map-based activities in person. That's it from me. Thank you for listening, and thanks again to the organizers for inviting me to the stage.
Thanks, Matthias. So now we're going to move to the discussion, which Chandana Mitra will chair this discussion. So I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. So what we'll do is, the way this is designed, the webinar is we're going to have a discussion, and then we'll open the floor for question answers. So to begin with, we will have Dr. Jason Ching and Dr. Gerald Mills, who will have 2 or 3 minutes to speak on the applications of LCC. And then we are going to have Dr. Julia Hidalgo, who's going to continue speaking on the applications of LCZ. So to begin with, a little introduction to Dr. Jason Ching, and none of us here need any introduction or need to know about Dr. Ching. He is sort of the guru of WUDAPT project, as we all know. And then we have Dr. Gerald Mills. He's an associate professor in geography in the University College of Dublin. And then we have Dr. Julia Hidalgo. She is an urban researcher at the National Center of Scientific Research at the University of Toulouse. So with no further time, I will not take any more time. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Ching and Dr. Mills to speak about the applications of LCZ for 2 or 3 minutes.
Let's have Dr. Mills go first.
Thank you, John Donna. Thanks, Ian and Matthias. They're marvelous presentations. In fact, I find my notes are mostly irrelevant after your talks. Let me again give a personal story. I think critical to the development of WUDAPT databases was the formation of the IUC, which occurred in 2000. It occurred just after the last event in modern times of ICUC, which occurred in Sydney. At the next meeting that followed in Łódź, Tim Oak gave what I thought was a lovely presentation about ending of the solitudes. And a big part of that was about improving communication. I see the development of a database in cities as absolutely foundational for the development of urban climate science. I don't see any way around it. And I first came across Ian's work, obviously, and then in a subsequent discussion with Jason at a meeting in Hong Kong, I suggested that this should be the base by which we gather information on cities. It was at ICUC 8, where I met up with Benjamin, that Benjamin spoke about his methods of deriving local climate zones automatically. We held a meeting directly after the ICUC event, where we did the first occasion where we tried to put together databases. Valerie Masson was at that, Jason was at it, and a number of other people. So I think what we've seen is just how quickly this seed has developed and grown to provide us with starting information about cities worldwide. What I love about the local climate zones is that it is fundamentally connects together what I'd call global urban science, a comparison between cities, as well as emphasizing the need to actually go out and conduct field work on your own behalf and to connect the measurements, the observations you're getting to the place from which it was obtained. In my last webinar, I spoke about MIRUP, a paper that was written in 1968. And if you recollect, if you happen to attend, he did talk about the potential role that remote sensing could provide in telling us about cities. And he talked in 1968 about the difficulty of obtaining useful information on cities. It is absolutely amazing to me that half the population of the planet live in places about which we know next to nothing. So I see the WUDAPT project as fulfilling many needs, one of which is providing what I'd call the basic physical geography of cities, which is what I think the local climate zones can provide. Once that's in place, you can build on it. So that's why the WUDAPT idea was based upon these levels of information. But I still fundamentally believe that the local climate zones have enormous power as a description of places. And I based this upon my experience of running ICUC 8, which happened to be in Dublin, where I was amazed at the number of people who were presenting. When you get in the abstracts, I was getting maybe 40% of the abstracts were only about urban heat islands. Now, that should tell you a great deal about how people enter into our field. And yet there was no sort of protocol available for a lot of those students, a lot of those new researchers coming into the field to structure their ideas in a way that it might be internationally available to everybody. And I saw local climate zones as clearly a way by which city-specific information could be made generalizable. So once again, Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Matthias. That was a marvelous introduction to the possibilities. After just 10 years, less than 10 years, what's actually possible, that we could actually have a database of cities globally that will be of immense value to a range of researchers.
Thank you, Gerald. Jason, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate seeing these wonderful presentations this morning, and Gerald with a little bit of history. Let me just give some thoughts to what significance it has, at least from my perspective. So we have seen the local climate zone maps and the distributions. We find that each city is unique. And concurrently, when you look at the information from those maps through the table lookups of urban canopy parameters, they also will be unique. So each city in the world will have a unique distribution. And it is this uniqueness that will power the information and the results of models that will be coming online. So the LCZs now in these maps, as you may have alluded to from Matthias's talk, is now in regional sections, Europe and North America. And so for the goal of the worldwide coverage, I think we can get to other sectors such as India, China, and so forth. And then we're really on our way to a worldwide database which can be used through these table lookups and further work that I want to talk about to the modeling that we so dearly need as tools for climate change and population growth. I want to also say that, and I think this might be covered by Julia, the WUDAPT, at least level 0 through local climate zones, can be linked to other modeling systems. Clearly, there are very fine detailed models such as ENVIMET. It's a microenvironment modeling a prognostic 3-dimensional high-resolution microclimate model. There's a UMAP link to I guess it's a urban multi-scale environmental predictor. It's a climate service tool, very versatile. There are links to WRF Chem, WRF CMAC. These are major systems, and they provide multi-scale air quality simulation capabilities. There's even systems that are not yet in place, but being worked on or being considered. One is a street and grid model called SING. It's for looking at human exposure in street canyons, for example. So there are numerous and almost infinite applications that are possible, given now that we have the local climate zone system. I'm not sure Gerald mentioned this, but in terms of the overview of WUDAPT, we're looking at the information through these maps, through the data that gets us climate urban canopy parameters, but that we might be seeking further details. And you saw the need for that in the two speakers' talks this morning. I'd like to just say that the next level of WUDAPT that is being worked on right now is a 5-pillared approach for what we call local climate, for WUDAPT level 1 and 2. Very quickly, we're after fine resolution in these local climate zones of form and function. These are, we're looking at some innovative methods, one of which is the digital synthetic city, which creates information at block scales. A UMEP, a BEM model, a building energy model. Gerald is looking in, leading that. A tool for generating then UCPs with the backing of the WUDAP community. This would be a tool that's being generated in Hong Kong. And it's a tool that will, how do you say, be capable of generating outputs that are useful as inputs to the modeling system. The other two pillars include the portal. It should be a very important thing for gathering our community together going forward, and city-specific test beds to test these new innovations and then to apply them, and maybe then to go forward with a lot of different kinds of imaginative applications. So it's I'll conclude with this. WUDAPT it's fun, it's exciting, but I think it serves the world in a very major challenge, in a very thoughtful way. And it's a community-based system, and we can't go forward without the community. So join us as we go forward with these test beds and activities. But I think first, let's thank those who have created this LCZ system. It's a great step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Julia, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and hi everybody. Thank you for the invitation to comment on the potential of local climate zone in urban planning. Here in France, we did a study 3 years ago with 2 colleagues, with Guillaume Dumas and Cinda Westjouve, and we analyzed the use and the degree of appropriation of local climate zone in different cities in France by local authorities, in particular for cities: Paris, Rennes, that is a city situated on the west, and Nancy on the east, and in Toulouse. And we analyzed, we were interested in who pilot the development of these local climate zone maps, which was the context and the methodology used, and the availability of the data to everybody. And what we saw is that the local context played an important role. For Paris, for example, the local climate zone map was developed by the Urban Planning Agency, that it's a structure that supports urban planning at the local level, and developed this work in the context of the master plan. And also the COP21 in 2015 play an important role to boost the development. In Rennes, for example, the work was developed by collaboration between the local research group in urban climatology and the local authority of the city, also in the framework of the development of their master plan. And for Nancy and Toulouse were more related to research projects. In Toulouse was developed in a collaboration of our group, research group, and the local authority. But in Nancy, for example, it was developed by the CEREMA, that is the support structure, but at the national level. In this case, that help cities on territorial planning, but that is situated in Nancy. So it was also a local partner. As in France, we have a rich geographical information system. For the 4 cities, the first approach was to develop a local climate zone based on GIS approach, but the spatial scale was different depending on the cities and the teams. For Paris and Toulouse, we use an islet scale, so the patterns of buildings surrounded by roads. And in Nancy, for example, they used Urban Atlas, so an approach more land use oriented. And in Rennes, the spatial partitioning was based on the spatial partitioning of the master plan. So they try to use the same spatial scale than for the other environmental issues, for example, like air quality or noise. And the availability of the data at the end of the projects was also variable. For example, for Paris, they have a platform that you can consult. Toulouse, it's also open data, but for example, for Rennes and Nancy, they produce the data, but for an internal use. So what we saw here in France is that there is a very important role of the local partners, expertise, and also the context, in particular, to orientate the methodology and the scale of the spatial partitioning. And in urban planning context, at least here in France, this has a lot of importance, because here the climate plans and the master plans, for example, to address climate mitigation, they fix very clear methodologies. For example, they impose to do a carbon footprints evaluation that is imposed to the local authorities, but there is no guidelines or imposition in terms of methodology or tools or even the spatial scale to address climate adaptation. So my question to Matthias and Jan will be, what do you think about the potential of local climate zone framework to become, perhaps in the future, one of the basic tools to address thermal comfort management at the urban scale? And if you think it's an useful framework, which consensus must be expected around the methodological approaches, and in particular around the spatial scale of the information, because the resolution, the spatial resolution, is here one of the key points, because local authorities are always very sensitive to the impacts that mapped information has on land value. So as data producers, I think we must reflect on the collateral impacts also that those local climate zone maps can have. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. So Matthias and Ian, would you go ahead and answer first Julia's comment, and then we can, if you have time, we'll go on looking at the questions in the chat box.
Sure, I'll just respond quickly to the first question. And I don't know if Matthias wants to address the second question. Julia asked about the potential for using LCZs in the thermal comfort studies, if I understand correctly. Now, or at least for planning and management issues related to thermal comfort. I guess I have a two-pronged answer to that. Yes, it's certainly possible, partly because the LCZ system is created for simplicity and so that anyone can use it in different fields and by people who are not specialists in climatology or microclimatology. So that includes, planners and architects and so on. So it is all about sharing information and communicating information in ways that everyone can understand. So that automatically envelops a number of different fields and different applications. However, it's the particular application that we have to be careful with. And if we're studying thermal comfort, we're obviously interested in more than just the local scale. We're very interested in the micro scale, and we're interested in more than just temperature. We're interested in relative humidity and wind and so on. And all of those things become quite complicated at the micro scale and are not captured essentially by the LCZ. So we have to be careful with scale, and we have to be careful with the climate variables that we're interested in. And so, for example, if we go into one LCZ class, we're going to see a multitude of different thermal comfort levels, depending on what side of the street you're standing or next to a tree and so on. So there are many more issues that need to be considered. However, the LCZ, as I always say, is a good starting point for any kind of study, and it gets it gets a spatial framework for you within which to become more detailed and to take on other considerations. So I don't know if Matthias wants to add anything to that or to the second question.
No, I very much align with you, Ian, on the first question. For me personally, I've been in a situation as well to talk about, well, not necessarily thermal comfort, but just thermal characteristics of urban areas towards policymaking and urban planning. And for me, I find that the LCZ a very helpful starting point for communication, because it's just clear and simply described, even though it doesn't capture all the very micro scale heterogeneity. It's like a very good starting point and a very good basis to get you going and to be on the same page, because often we use different terminology and it's hard to get the message across. Your second question, Julia, was about the spatial scale. Is that correct? I missed part of it because I was trying to answer some of the questions in the chat at the same time, so I'm sorry about that.
Yes. The second part of my question is more about which kind of consensus we must have related to the methodology, and in particular to the spatial scale, but not only, because here when we are trying to propose methodologies to address adaptation in the climate plans, for example, and we talk about local climate zone, there are a diversity of approaches. Could be GIS developed, also the approach proposed by UDAPT from satellite, and this is quite confusing for people, or at least for non-specialists. So it's in the perspective to try to go ahead and to propose in a French perspective, for example, to try to use local climate zone as a base, even if I agree with Jan that we must use other data, not only a local climate zone, but also climate data, and to have in mind the context. Local climate zone, for me, allows to address because as they are accompanied by indicators, it's easy for communication. I really agree with that. But as we are not applying the same methodology everywhere, it's quite confusing sometimes. And in terms of the spatial scale, there are some sensitive also questions related to for example, the impact that this information can have on the land cost, on the land value. I think everybody can understand, for example, when we see a noise map or air quality map, the impact that this information has on land value, at the very local scale. So these are aspects that my colleagues that works on urban studies tell me. So keep in mind always that this information that you are mapping will be taken by promoters, for example, or by the general public, and this will have an impact also on real dynamics of the urbanism. So it's just one thing that I can just give to you to reflect also. It's just in this sense.
Hello, thanks, and I very much align what you're saying. It's a complicated question, and for me the question of scale very much depends on the intended application as well. But apart from that, for me personally, working with the LCZ mapping scheme from especially a digital perspective and an automated mapping perspective, whenever I write a piece on that, I always try to make it crystal clear where the LCZs come from, what they were designed for, and what their intended use is. Because I mean, we are diverting a lot from its intentional use, from its original use, which might still be, I mean, it's still valid, but we really have to be careful with how we use it and how we communicate it. So that's personally how I try to address this, but I guess Ian can add much more to that.
Well, I won't add a lot, but I'll just say that the LCZ is not a methodology, it's a concept. And if you read the original paper in 2012 or any of the work that came before that on other systems, you'll see that there isn't much attention given to methodology. It's more about laying down the basic concepts and the need for a system and so on. The methods were meant to evolve organically and from different users, and that's happened. And I agree with Julia that it's difficult to get a consensus of methodologies for how to use LCZs, but I suppose the WoodApp community would say that that is a very good attempt at creating some consensus for a methodology. So perhaps that's perhaps the best answer that I can give, and if there's a WoodApp person that wants to build on that. So I think, again, the starting point is always understanding the concepts, and the methods, of course, are developing in different directions, but the work that the WoodApp community has done, I think, is probably the closest thing that we have to some sort of consensus. And it may not work for everyone. There are other methods available, but we're all working from the same basis and the same foundation, and I think that's maybe what's most important. Thanks, Julia. Those are very good observations.
So thank you. And what we'll do is we are 3 minutes over past the hour, but because the discussion is really going well and we're learning more about LCZs. So the plan is to continue with a few of the questions, and anyone who's able to hang around, please be with us. So to begin with, I have this, and some of the questions Matthias has already addressed in the chat box. So we'll take some time to look at which ones are not addressed, which are the questions. So to begin with, I'll go with first question by Lee Chapman, as in, how do you see the hyper-local climate zones in relation to LCZs? Matthias or anyone?
Or Lee, do you want to elaborate?
I guess I'd better answer. I'm just trying to stir things up a bit as usual. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the questions in the chat actually about, you know, so much heterogeneity. How do we deal with this? What scale are we dealing with? We're really realistically only limited here by the resolution of the satellite imagery and what we can do in terms of tools to do these automatic classifications now. So the question is, how granular do we get here? And I'm thinking about that intra-variability we've got in local climate zone. Can we get down to that hyper-local level? Can we start talking about that? And if we can really inform future sensor network deployments, that kind of thing. So just, Ian, I'm sure you've got a framework for hyper-local climate zones up your sleeve. Have you, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah.
Well, for the digital mapping, I'll leave that one to Matthias. Yeah, the question of heterogeneity comes up, and I see it's coming up in the chat. And it's easy to overlook that when you start with the LCZs, and the assumption is that everything is tidy and uniform. Obviously, that's not the case. But again, I always say that use the LCZs as you want and as they're helpful to you, and that should be in laying down a basic spatial framework. When you look at a space that might be complicated and uniform, if you stand back, you should be able to see some degree of patterns and repetition and so on. That's a starting point. And if that's as much as it helps you, that's good. And you can drop the LCZs at that point and go into more detailed studies from that and more granular studies from that. So, you know, the LCZ may only be helpful to a point, but it's still serving its purpose to, you know, it's laying down the spatial framework. For the more automated approaches, I don't know if maybe Matthias wants to tackle that one. But.
Well, I think in a way, Lee, this is already addressed, because nowadays many people build automated procedures using GIS databases, which are very detailed, up to often a meter resolution, mapping single buildings in all their details, but using that information to make hyperlocal local climate zone maps, well, hyper local HLCZs then. So this work is being done already. So there's many activities in that domain. But we have a youngster. Oh, okay. Let's see if this works better. What was I about to say? So for me personally, it again depends on the application. For example, I very much like the scheme because it allows you to get a first order approximation of the built surface, especially for areas for which you do not have a lot of detailed data, and that's extremely relevant. I mean, if I would have GIS data set for all cities in the globe, then I would be good. I could perform all the applications I wanted, but that's not the case. So often I have to fall back to the LCZ as a first order approximation. So yeah, for me it depends very much again on the intended use of the scheme and its information it provides.
May I jump in on this? The whole question of scale is very important. WUDAP, kind of in my thoughts about it, is based upon 40 years of work at the Environmental Protection Agency, where we had to deal with modeling tools that would serve people to come up with policy based upon the best available science. So here, in terms of WUDAP, we have the approach of looking at the applications as fit for purpose. Julia mentioned a very key one that hits our pocketbooks. The outcome of what we decide in terms of policy makes a difference in so many different ways. The job I think that we have in WUDAP is to ensure that the quality of the information, be it the data or the models that run from the data, are supportable by the science. That's key. And if the science doesn't stand up, it's got to be improved. So we're trying to come up with a strategy that gets to the issue of what kind of tools make sense to what kind of questions. You may want, the organizers of these webinars may want to consider a webinar clearly on the types of applications and the fitness of the tools for those applications as a topic. It's a very important one because climate and climate policy is going to depend upon the basis for the, how do you say, the results that politicians and stakeholders will utilize. So it's very important to be organized in what we try to say is fit for purpose for what application. And the applications are myriad, infinite. The point was made that local climate zone is a very important starting point. It is. It helps direct our thinking. But then the microclimate and the micro climate zones, they become detail that we need to address. And they'll be scale dependent. And where we can't get the data or we can't get the tools developed well enough, we have to come up with hybrid systems like the ENVIMET came up with the microclimate modeling to attach to what we could provide at the block and larger scales. So it's you have to be very careful and very thoughtful. We're looking at collecting data that we can support that is scale dependent. And we need to state what those assumptions and as the framework for the quality of the information. So I can go on and on, but you get the gist, I think.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And so most of the questions I've seen that Matthias has addressed already in the chat, and I can see Julian and Rajeshree's questions are more or less addressed by the discussion which we had between Jason, Matthias, Ian, and Julia. So to have the last question, I can see a hand raised from TKM. And I'm sorry, I don't know your name though, but TKM, if you can, please go ahead and ask your question. Hoping yours will be different. And you are muted, please.
My name is Teresa. I'm from Salvador, Bahia, Brazil. And our urban environment. Hello, everybody. Before I continue, I don't want to take a long time. So I just want to say thank you for the presentation, and also to let you know that we have developed here, because of our lack of data. We had about a 1992 kind of a cartographic map, where we had very little information, only about the occupation. And then we developed a system based on the different types of residential areas, because we live in a very unequal social and spatial and economic society, that's Brazil. And so the built areas are completely different. That's why we decided to use this approach back in beginning of 2000 with Professor Lutz, organizing with us this map, which we called land use occupation map. And we developed these patterns. And after we managed to get a digital orthophotos from the local government, now we're improving it, we're actually updating it a bit. And we have developed also some local measurements in different types of patterns, urban occupation patterns, which are very close to each other, and then they show different values. We are going to present, we're actually writing a paper for the CyberGeo journal about this methodology that we think it's interesting for those areas which do not have enough data, or maybe the data is not updated enough, like we had here. We had very little information to start developing the urban climate map with Professor Lutz back in the 2000s. So that's what we did, and we used a map at the 1 to 10,000 scale. And we also used the knowledge we had, a physical model of the city that the local government managed to keep up, not so up to date, but at least we could use it. And some visiting the city. It's a large city, it's a peninsula and tropical area, and also very unequal in terms of typical built areas, because we have, it's like Colombia. You showed a picture of Colombia. It's like that. We are also a very hilly topography in terms of small hills, about 0 to 60 meters, 70 meter high. But we think this is a tool that could assist some areas which do not have information. And we're thinking maybe we can measure different types of urban occupation patterns and then compare. We also have only about 2 meteorological stations for reference. And like
I think you got muted. Sorry, the last 20 seconds you were muted.
Oh, I just said that our meteorological station, we have about 2, and one of them is a very vegetated area, which does not exactly represent the urbanized area, which have different patterns. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was good to hear from Brazil. So now I think it's 15 minutes past the hour. And of course, this is such good discussion. There's never an end to a discussion like this. So what I'll do is I'll hand it back to Natalie, and she can wrap it up.
Great. So thanks for the presentations and a very interesting discussion. I think think there's a lot more to be said. I think maybe we should have planned it 2 hours or something. But yeah. Anyways, thanks very much for attending. So we're in the middle of organizing the next couple of webinars. Will be so one will be on remote sensing, and so we have a couple of topics lined up. So yeah, thanks everyone. I think that's it. Yeah, have a good evening, morning, or wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.